All right. Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Vermont State Senate Committee on Institutions. Today is the 11th of January, 2022. We are in a conversation about the reopening of the judicial branch that's continuing over from last week. And today we're going to get that perspective and more, I hope, from the Department of Corrections. I am Joe Benning, the chair of this committee. I am from the Caledonia District, which is all of Caledonia County and the 6 northeasternmost towns of Orange County. We also have on the screen Senator Ingalls from Essex Orleans, Senator Mazza from Grand Isle Colchester, Senator McCormick from Windsor, and I am hoping at some point this afternoon to be joined by Senator Parent from Franklin County. To all the witnesses, just a reminder, we are live on YouTube, and I do not know how many millions of people are watching us, but I would imagine that most of whoever are may not be as familiar with the vernacular that you and I usually use in this process. So should you make mention of something that flags for me a possible inability of somebody to understand what that may be, I may freeze everything and ask you to explain what X, Y, or Z happens to be. We all have internet connections which vary in their effectiveness. And one of the other problems I've noticed, especially with the cold weather, is that sometimes screens freeze up. So if you hear me saying that your screen is frozen or whatnot, you may understand what's going on there. Having said all that, Commissioner Demmel from the Department of Corrections is first on my list. We were speaking a moment off camera, so to speak, and I'm interested in continuing the conversation about the reopening of the judicial branch and how the Department of Corrections is feeling that process, whether it's working, not working, what the concerns may be. And beyond that, I notice you have quite a few of your staff here. We might want to have a general conversation about corrections and talk about your assimilation, if you will, into the commissioner's position and how you like it and why you don't like it. And eventually, if we get around to talking about Rachel Feldman, it'll be okay by me. Beyond that, Commissioner, welcome to Senate Institutions, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you again, Senator Benning, and to the other members of the committee. Thank you all for having us. I am Nick Demmel, the Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Corrections, and I have brought with me a team of people far smarter than me to help us through this very complicated process. And I'm certain that they'd be happy to answer any other questions that you may have about corrections more broadly as well. I will start with our testimony as it relates to the reopening of the judiciary, if that works for you, Senator, but would be happy to expand into any other topics that you find useful or relevant. And I'm certainly happy to talk about my assimilation here. For those of you who aren't aware, I am now entering my 2nd year as the commissioner, but really only my 3rd month on the job. So much to learn, and certainly have learned much in the last 3 months. And looking forward to our work together between the department and the legislature going forward. On the topic of reopening the courts and the judiciary, I had the opportunity to watch much of the testimony that's been given on this topic already. And while I agree with many of the comments that were made previously, I'm going to limit our testimony to the impact that the court closure and the prospect of a reopening of the judiciary has had and would have on the Department of Corrections. Because the court system has largely been closed during the pandemic, the Department of Corrections has been forced to reconfigure many of its facilities to create ad hoc courthouses within the correction system. As you're well aware, there are 14 criminal courts, 14 civil courts, 14 family courts, and a federal court system here in Vermont. So for the individuals in our care, the department has had to manage the court processes within its facilities for 43 separate court systems. As you're well aware, the department only has 6 facilities across the state. And so you can imagine that all of that court process that's now moved inside the walls of the Department of Corrections is spread amongst only 6 facilities. So it is my opinion that while the courts themselves are in fact closed, the system itself has not closed, but instead the daily management of that physical space of the courthouse has shifted to the Department of Corrections for those individuals under the care and custody of the department. We have been forced to reconfigure many of our units to accommodate these DOC courtrooms. We've had to change chapels, visitation rooms, offices, other personal workspaces, and we've had to change our programming spaces to account for court space that can be used by the incarcerated population when they're required to testify or when they are seeking hearings in front of the judiciary. We have also borne the burden of instituting the COVID-19 mitigations that are required to keep those individuals safe while they are participating in their court hearings, while they are being moved between housing units to attend their court hearings. We have had to take the mitigation measures to clean and prepare those units and then break them down at the end of the day and clean and prepare them and clean them between the court hearings if there are multiple individuals who are being required to testify. While that has all happened, our staff have had to become ad hoc court clerks, where they are printing documents. They're responding to requests for assistance from the incarcerated population. They're providing non-legal guidance on court forms. All of that work that would otherwise be done in the courthouse itself is now being done in the DOC courthouse spaces that we've had to set up at our facilities. Throughout this, we've had no increase in staff, either from the judiciary or an increase just in general. And we've had no resources to help us with this problem or account for the additional cost that the department is incurring to enable the continuation of the court process for those incarcerated individuals. And all of this is set to the backdrop of a serious staffing crisis within the Department of Corrections, which you are all certainly aware of. But it has pushed the department, not simply the closure of the courts, but our own staffing issues that exist separate from the closure of the courts, has pushed the department to its limits. And then we overlay the additional burdens that we're taking on to ensure that people have access to the judicial system, and it becomes a really untenable situation. I say all that, but I also understand and I sympathize with the courts and with all public institutions who have had to manage the impacts of the pandemic. I know firsthand what that is like, having done it for the Department of Corrections, and I know that there aren't any easy answers to this. There are just different, often bad answers that we all have to make, and these decisions are very challenging. And so I do sympathize with them, but unfortunately, I feel that the department has taken on a substantial burden that is outside of its normal operating procedures. It's outside the statutory requirements of the department. And unfortunately, the department is having to solve for the COVID mitigations, having to solve to enable people to get to their hearings and participate in the judicial process. And so from my perspective, the reopening of the judiciary would certainly alleviate a burden on the Department of Corrections at a time where it's critical that we find ways to alleviate the burden, particularly on our staff. And enable our facilities to return to the configurations that best suit the needs, that enable programming, that allow us to already account for isolation and quarantine spaces, which we've had to carve out of our facilities to protect the general population of incarcerated individuals. It certainly would be a benefit to the Department of Corrections if the judiciary were up and running. There are also a variety of impacts that this has on us that don't necessarily have to do with the physical infrastructure of the Department of Corrections, but still have significant burdens on us. I can give you a couple of examples of that, but if that's outside the scope of your inquiry, I'd be happy to pause there and answer any questions.
Well, to some extent, it's outside the committee's jurisdiction to talk about these things. Unfortunately, part of our I guess I'll call it an obstacle for the legislature's perspective is that we don't necessarily have committees that cross all the lines that are necessary in order to have this conversation. So to some extent, during the past few days, we have been hearing about operational problems, but I've been trying to keep it steered to understanding the physical plants and why various operational problems are surfacing and what future needs you may have to have. And I'd like to use as an example, you've described the courtroom has moved from the courtroom to the correctional facility. Can you just give us a brief discussion of what that actually means?
Certainly. So in a pre-COVID situation, the Department of Corrections would prepare an incarcerated individual for transport to the courthouse of jurisdiction where their judicial proceeding was going to occur. So one of those 14 criminal, civil, or family courts, or the federal system, which is slightly different. And so I'll exclude them from this conversation. So we would prepare that individual for transport, and then the sheriff's office or the statewide sheriff's contract that governs transportation would have that individual transported to a courthouse where they would proceed with their judicial proceeding. At the end of that, in a criminal matter, if the individual was then released from custody, that individual would leave from the courthouse and have no further interaction with the Department of Corrections. For a civil matter, if the person was incarcerated, they would then be returned back to the Department of Corrections, and that would also be true for the family court matters. But as it's happening now, those proceedings are largely happening from the Department of Corrections. And so either an individual is So in most circumstances, an individual is brought to the area within the department, within the facility that is deemed the hearing area. So they have the WebEx system, which you described, I think, in previous, but basically a virtual video conferencing system from the courts where they can participate in their testimony. But as I think some of the previous testimony discussed, document sharing and things of that nature become very difficult. And so it's become incumbent on the department through our own voluntary efforts to ensure that the process is smooth, that we print documents for the individual and help them with those paperwork needs. In the criminal example, if at the end of that hearing, the individual were released from the department's custody, so in an arraignment hearing, for example, while they would normally be released in the courthouse where they had jurisdiction, which is likely the area that they live in, or at least close, now they are housed at one of our 6 facilities that could be anywhere in the state, depending on their needs and the needs of the department. They are being transported by the Department of Corrections upon their release back to the area from which they were arrested. That can often create a huge burden on the Department of Corrections, a burden that we had not previously had to endure, and one that we simply don't have the staffing to continue in the long term. There are other complications that arise in the hearing format itself. For those of you who are or are not aware, under our COVID mitigation protocols, housing units are separated from each other during the COVID pandemic so that we don't have cross-contamination of the virus amongst the housing units. But we don't house individuals in each unit based on when their court proceedings will occur or what types of court proceedings they will have. And so we have requirements that individuals be presented for their hearings who may be from different housing units, forcing us to cross-contaminate the populations. And so we've done a nice job of trying to mitigate that where possible. But inevitably, there's going to be some crossover there due to scheduling requirements from the courts, due to court orders that we have to follow, things of that nature. Those are a couple of examples of where the process itself becomes very challenging, in addition to the fact that we've had to reconfigure spaces to account for this.
So the spaces that you have now created, can you describe for us what goes on in those spaces in order for the various unit detainees or incarcerated individuals to come in, and what has to happen to the physical surroundings each and every time they come and go? Yeah,
it might be best if I hand that question to one of our legal team members who are responsible for managing those processes, if you'll permit.
Sure.
So I'm not sure if Emily or Cheryl would like to address that question.
I think it would be best if Cheryl did. There she is. Thank you.
Cheryl, before you begin, if you could just identify yourself and let us know what you do for the record.
Yes, I'm Cheryl Eliverta, and I am one of the facility operations managers for the department, and I oversee several aspects of facility functions. So what I guess I would like to walk you through is something I'd done recently with a defense attorney. We had received a lot of complaints from defense attorneys about access to their clients and our inability to have them available at a moment's notice. So I asked one of them to come to Southern State with me, and I showed her exactly what it looks like to bring somebody. So if I were to walk you through that, I think you might understand a little bit about our attempts to mitigate COVID in our buildings and our attempts to also work within the court system. So at Southern State, the kiosk courtroom, not the WebEx, but the kiosk courtroom is in booking. And pre-COVID, we could have 30 people, 20 people, 12 people sitting in booking, waiting.
You've used the term kiosk.
Yes, it's a court. It's the court machine that's on our walls. It's a direct line to the court, video and audio.
Thank you.
And it belongs to the court system. It's not DOC's equipment. So in past, before COVID, somebody would be just sitting in booking and they would just go one at a time into that room. With COVID, they're in a completely different unit. As people come in, we process them and we put them in quarantine. And as you've seen in many recent news articles lately, our quarantine is stopping COVID from getting into the building. All of our incarcerated population positives have been at intake, not in the building. So that has been really great at how we've managed COVID, having these quarantine units. But the quarantine unit is not booking, and it is not where the courthouse kiosk is. So it requires a staff member, and at Southern State, at that time it was in Foxtrot. It's a good 10-15 minute walk to go down to Foxtrot. I'll use a technical term of donning their PPE, which means just putting on all of their PPE that's required to go into that unit, getting a person, walking them back up to that room. We have to shut down the entire movement of the facility because we can't walk a person from quarantine through a building when other people are walking through the building. So all movement stops in the building. We bring that person to the kiosk. Yes, Mr. McCormick, Senator McCormick.
What is Foxtrot?
Foxtrot is one of our units at Southern State. I don't know if you've ever been there. I'm happy to bring anybody to that facility and show you how this looks in person. It's one of our buildings where we house people. It's separate from the main area of the building. So it's an outside, we have to walk outside to another unit, to housing unit.
Is that the most secure unit in the building?
They're all this. I mean, they're all within the same walls, basically. So it's just the way they go down the road, Delta Echo Fox. It's just a different unit that we use. So walking that person then back up to the courthouse in booking. And then that person has their hearing. And then we have to walk that person back. And then it's a switch of PPE, get the next person and bring them up. So the process alone, just to bring people back from court to court and back to the unit, is a good 10-15 minutes per person. So that has been part of the physical plant that we have, that, you know, for us to mitigate COVID, but also meet the needs of the court, they sort of don't mesh well together as far as a quick court hearing. The court has asked us many times to have people available at a minute's notice, you know, and that doesn't necessarily work for us. We cannot do that. Previous to COVID, when everybody was sitting and booking, it was a lot easier. It still wasn't smooth. It still wasn't perfect. We still had a lot of complaints. But with our COVID mitigations to keep our population safe, it's more than complicated our ability to meet the court's needs.
So if somebody is literally in the kiosk attending a court hearing, and another inmate is in need of speaking with their attorney for an upcoming hearing, how does that take place?
We have attorney lines in each unit. We also have other ways we can transfer phone calls in. That itself has been challenging. This isn't part of the physical plant, but one of the challenges with court is these arraignments don't happen until usually afternoon, sometimes late afternoon. The department also has standard head counts where all facility movement has to stop, and we count all the people that we are accountable to make sure they're safe and know where they all are. So a lot of times court hearings are in the middle of head count too, which has happened quite frequently with the Rule 5 hearings. So there's just a lot of logistics about having a courtroom in a facility, COVID or not COVID, that just don't align with the mission that the department has. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
It does. Thank you. Did you have anything else you wanted to say? Well, let me rephrase that. Anything else you can educate us on?
I think at this point, I guess I'll defer back to the commissioner, and if there's specific things, I mean, there's certainly, I guess what I could say is the resources that the department has, and the commissioner to touch on this, just are not there to support a court system in the correctional system. In addition to the kiosks with the WebExes, there's an expectation from the court that we're just available at any given time for the people to have in front of a computer screen. And that's just not the case. A lot of our staff that are caseworkers normally working this are redeployed to actually the security of our building right now with the staffing issues that we have, which the commissioner also touched on as well too. So there's many other things I think we can talk about, but as far as buildings and the institution itself, those are the main pieces. I did hear yesterday in testimony that there's, I wrote it down, but I think there's a committee that's being set up to look at the continuation of video court that the court is setting up. I'm not sure if the Department of Corrections is on that committee, but it seems like if we're going to be part of a video solution, we should be part of that committee. And I don't believe that we are. So that is, I guess, one thing I would like to bring up. And then there's, I'm happy to talk about aspects of our relationship with the sheriffs and other things that we put together, and our staffing ratios that we think we need if we're going to run a courthouse in the corrections department, but I'm not sure that that's this part of the conversation.
So let me just pause here to say, if there is such a committee being developed and you are frustrated about being kept out, this crosses the lines of both this committee's and the Judiciary Committee. Please let me know who and where I should be contacting people, and I'll try to get you hooked into that network of individuals.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, ball's back in your court.
Yeah, I think, Cheryl did a nice job of highlighting with a real salient example of where we're running into the rub here. The only other aspect of this that I would just add is, I heard in some testimony earlier, and it wasn't exactly on this point, but that each individual court was entitled to manage the situation for themselves. What that looks like for the Department of Corrections, though, is inconsistency in process and how we're being required to satisfy the needs of the courts. And that has become very challenging. In some instances, the courts appear to understand the burdens that they're putting on us and have found ways to streamline the process and make it simpler. And in other courts, probably due to their overwhelming dockets, it's, this is what they need and here's the order coming down, or here's the request coming down. So even if we could build in uniformity in the process of how this is managed, that would certainly go a long way to easing the burden on the Department of Corrections. And to your last offer of assistance, Senator, certainly we would take you up on that and appreciate your assistance in that process of getting involved in something that will have huge ramifications on the Department of Corrections going forward.
Well, I know that Judge Zone from time to time watches these proceedings. I was hoping to see his name pop up on the screen all of a sudden, but I will certainly follow through with Judge Zone and see if we can't get some communication lines up. I don't know at this point whether you have additional information you'd like to give us. We have a lot of time to play with. You can introduce the rest of the folks on your screen if you'd like. Or if you had additional information you wanted to educate us on.
Certainly, I'd love to introduce some of the other folks that we have with us today. And I'll let them, if you permit, let them give a brief moment of introduction for themselves. But we have our general counsel, Emily Carr. You met Cheryl, and then we also have our chief of operations, Al Cormier, who I think is on the call, though I've lost his small box here somewhere along the way. If each of them wanted to introduce themselves, and if you'd permit, that might be a good use of our time.
Happy to. Emily, you're first one that popped up on my screen.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, Senators. I am Emily Carr, and I am the General Counsel for the Department of Corrections.
Al, I see you next.
Good afternoon. Al Cormier, Chief of Operations for the Department of Corrections. In my role, I oversee field services, facility services, policy and development, and the programming and education services.
Can we talk a little bit about the facilities themselves and what is in need around the system?
Sure. Commissioner, do you want to? My apologies. Yeah, I can certainly take that, Commissioner, unless you want to.
By all means, Al, please.
So, Senator Benning, I think you're familiar with the HOK study from last year that was completed on the feasibility of building a new facility or several new facilities in our state. We're currently working with BGS to release the second phase of that, which is an RFP going out at the end of this month, the beginning of February, to look at the design and programming of a potential new facility to include a reentry facility for the female population. As you know, all of our facilities are in need of some repairs. There's an outstanding cost associated with deferred maintenance that I think this committee is fully aware of. COVID has certainly impacted our ability to do ongoing maintenance and upgrades within our facility because of the mitigation factors that we put into place and at times a difficulty getting contractors to even come into our buildings. Some of those programs are on track for the spring. We're hoping to continue with that. That one of those major projects is the door and lock control project at Southern State Correctional Facility. We did Northern State last year. St. Johnsbury is next in line for that. What we found out of that feasibility study from HOK is really the need for an intense look at our system and what is going to best suit both the population incarcerated, our staff, and the taxpayers of Vermont. We're in a situation where those facilities are in need of some massive repairs, whether it's structurally, the building itself, our perimeter fencing, internal kitchens that are working with equipment that's 30 or 40 years old. We've got some outdated systems out there.
So we're trying to stay on top of what our House counterparts are doing in preparation for the point where they send us over the capital bill. Are you approaching them with any kind of a budget adjustment request right now?
Not as far as the facilities themselves go. We're waiting for the next phase of this RFP to come out and see what that study shows.
And do we have an understanding of the timing of the RFP deadline and what you expect for timing to be able to produce some kind of a report to the legislature about what that RFP has resulted in? So
BGS has the lead on the RFP being put out. And as I said, that was hopefully the end of this month, the beginning of February. I think they're looking at a 6 to 8 week turnaround on that. We're hoping to have something before the end of this legislative session to provide to both the House and Senate on the recommendations coming out of that. But I don't have a fixed timeline right now.
Okay. Anything else that anybody needs to say? With that, I'm going to turn it over to the committee and see if anybody has any questions. Senator McCormick, you're still muted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this, unlike the Institutions Committee in the House, which just has jurisdiction over corrections. We just have jurisdiction over brick and mortar, over the physical entity. Could you just speak specifically to how brick and mortar problems cause or worsen your program problems? What would need to change physically to improve your ability to program?
So just in terms of judiciary or in terms of overall corrections?
Overall.
Overall, so our spaces are very limited. The way those facilities were designed 20 years ago, 30 years ago even, is not where we are now with programming. We've historically with corrections, it's been let's lock them up and they'll get their programming when they get out. We're doing a lot more internally now with risk reduction programming. So space issues where we would need to have space for 30 or 40 individuals in a program, we may have room for 10 or 15. So the quarters are tight. The cells themselves are small. We are an agency that will never be accredited by the American Correctional Association because of our square footage inside of our facilities. The living size of the cells there's a formula that's there that shows square footage of living space with general population space and open space. We'll never meet that. So as an agency, that's kind of discouraging to think that we could never get full accreditation from the ACA only because of the size of our facilities. We've seen our population drop with COVID. We're slowly seeing it start to creep up, and we expect it to continue to increase as the judiciary does open. Space is an issue. We still have 137 individuals out of state. We would like to get those individuals back. They belong in Vermont, but we don't have the space to do that. When we have single individual cells with 2 individuals in them and double cells with 3 individuals in them, that's a problem. It doesn't make for a humane environment. As we move forward with changes in our operations, we're looking to really humanize the experience for the population and for our staff. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the Prison Research and Innovation Network. That's something that we're working on with UVM and the Urban Institute right now, that is really looking at how we improve the conditions inside of our facilities. We're very limited with education space, with vocational training. Southern State Correctional Facility, our newest facility, our largest facility, we have no vocational training in that building. That provides for hard time for folks when they have nothing to do to keep them occupied. So there are restrictions on what we can do because of, one, the size of the facility or the availability of just programming space in our facilities.
Sorry, I asked.
Senator Maza.
There was a time a few years ago, the governor had proposed a new facility in Vermont, and it met with some resistance, but the time has come that this thought's got to come back again so we can bring everybody back home in Vermont, not farm them out all over the country, because I think we owe it to our folks that are in prison to at least provide them with a safe place and take care of our own instead of shipping them out. So I think that subject will be brought up again someday, because it's not going to go away if we're going to have our independence and have all the prisoners back in Vermont again.
So I want to pick up something, Al, you spoke about, and that is the risk reduction programming, which is, in my eyes, having a direct impact on the numbers who are clogging the facilities. I don't understand the wisdom behind having to have, in the case I'm thinking of right now, the individual, in order to get risk reduction programming, has to have a full year's minimum before that they can be eligible for the programming. The programming itself, I believe in this case, was a 9-month program. If they have to have a full year minimum sentence in order to get a 9-month program in, they're clogging the facilities for the additional time period beyond that 9 months, whatever it may be. And I guess I'm curious as to, are there any efforts being done to change that policy? And I'm thinking of a case that I have right now where this is an issue in trying to resolve this person in a plea agreement. I see Cheryl's hand has popped up. Maybe she wants to take the lead on answering this, but I'm really curious because it seems to me that this is directly impacting the space availability for other people that may need to be provided a bed. So Cheryl, I'd love to hear the response to that.
If Al or the commissioner are fine, I'll take this question. So, okay. Quite some time ago, I don't know if any of you have seen Cullen Bullard. He's since retired, but he was our classification director. Cullen and I worked for a period of time on looking at what sentences needed to have happen for someone to get programming. Ultimately, what we came to an agreement on, and we went to the defense bars. They had their annual meeting. We went and talked to them. We spoke to I think we spoke to the judiciary as well too, but what we have just said is there really is no minimum needed. It could even be a 0 minimum or a 1-day minimum. What really we need to have happen is a max. If someone's going to program, we need the max end for them to program in the facility. So we have not been asking for minimums for quite some time. So I guess I'm curious the case that you are working on right now, and perhaps we could have a conversation about that separately. I'm happy to talk to you about our plans for programming and what that looks like and what our sentences look like. Years ago, you're correct. We used to say, you know, you have to factor in the RF window, you have to factor in classification time, you have to factor in how long the program is going to take, when the program starts, and we would come up with like this minimum that was needed. That's no longer needed. What we do now is if someone meets the requirements to program and they don't have the correct minimum because it's too short, maybe they get credit and they don't have enough on their minimum, we as a department will case staff them to program prior to release. And many of them program after their minimum. So there really is no arbitrary minimum anymore that we as a department have set, but that doesn't mean that somebody else hasn't asked for a minimum at some point. So, but again, I'm happy if it's a specific case, happy to talk with you offline about that and see what we can come up with for thoughts on that.
Well, I definitely want to have that conversation with you offline, but let me extend just a little bit and say, this is clearly not understood by a sizable portion of the people who are working within the Department of Corrections right now. Because this conversation involved several people in corrections who were giving us information that there had to be a specific minimum. And as a result, we were trying to come up with a plea agreement that would align appropriately for this individual. And yet we were also told that they could not be scheduled for the programming unless they had met a deadline for application purposes. I believe it was the first day of the last month of the quarter preceding when the programming would start. Now, to me, all of what I've just told you results in people taking up bed space in the facilities that we don't have enough beds for. And I'm really concerned that there's a message that hasn't translated throughout the ranks. I'm happy to have this conversation with you offline. I wished I'd had this conversation a week ago because I'm sticking my neck way out there on being sued for malpractice from what I'm hearing for you right now. So let's have this conversation offline. Emily, you might want to join us in that conversation in case I need counsel. It really is, in my eyes, critical because there are people within the system right now keeping people occupying beds where they shouldn't be. And that's a facilities problem. So thank you very much for that answer, but let's have that conversation offline.
Absolutely. The second part of what you said is accurate, though. We do have to have, and it's because of movement and where people are, but because as Al explained, we don't have programming at all 6 facilities. We have programming at specific facilities. So we have to know who needs to be moved to what facility when, including coming from out of state. So that requires us to have sort of like a hard deadline of knowing who's going to be sitting in the chairs for programming at that time. So that second part of the conversation you said does exist, but it doesn't mean that we still can't work around as far as what the minimum would look like. Personally, to me, adding a minimum always means adding on the max. That's what I've always seen in my career, right? If you add a year to the min, somehow that magically added a year to the max in a plea agreement. So that's never what the department wanted to see as an intention to that, which is why we worked on not having to have a set minimum to program in a facility. So again, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have a conversation offline about how that worked or doesn't work for you. And Emily's more than welcome to join.
Cheryl, if you could shoot me an email with your contact information, I would definitely follow up on that.
I will do that.
The other part of that equation of when a person becomes eligible and when they are supposed to apply, it's another delay point that triggers somebody taking up bed space. And I'm not sure how to solve this problem, but it is a problem that I suspect could eliminate a few of the current occupied beds as we speak. And
I think
don't know what they're doing.
if you think about it similar to like the way college courses run, like you have to start with everybody at the same time, and then the next
Right.
semester doesn't start for a period of time. That's sort of how our programming is run. So if you get sentenced in the middle of that program window, you're not going to start till the next program window, which they're 3 months each. So there is some delay time in that, but it's, if you consider it similar to how colleges run their course semesters, it's exactly the same way we run ours.
Well, using your example, the course running is more of an operational problem, which is outside the scope of our committee, but we dovetail into that conversation by people not lining up appropriately. And in my eyes, that's simply taking up bed space that should be used by people from out of state, et cetera. So yes, I thank you very much for that information. And as soon as we get off here, I'm going to go into that file and see if I can't make some negotiations happen with a certain prosecutor in the Northeast Kingdom who some of us know fairly well. I can't tell you who that is, but I can tell you it's the only he that's in this Northeast Kingdom prosecutorial staff.
I can,
Okay.
if I can add to that, we are working internally. I know this is operational, but to revamp the programming requirements and timeframes to try to lessen that
Okay.
time commitment.
Well, I appreciate that, but I would urge that a message go out immediately to all quarters from the folks who calculate your sentence structures through probation officers who are giving advice to state's attorneys. This is bed space being occupied that does not need to be. Committee, other questions?
Cheryl, any relation to Jake?
We're the only two besides our daughter in the state. So yes, that would be, yeah.
Oh, it is? Okay. Well, tell him I said hi. I miss him a lot.
I will. He's in Washington, D.C. right now. I'll let him know when he's back.
Oh, yeah, great guy. Yeah, many years we worked together. I thought that name looked familiar. I said, I gotta check that.
He
Well,
speaks very
ladies-
highly of you, sir.
We can disabuse him of that if you'd like us to tell you some things about Dick, but
Well, Jake worked for DMV for many years. Just a great guy to work with, so I miss him.
I appreciate, ladies and gentlemen, you're coming along to join us this afternoon. I'm sure we will be seeing you back again. And I guess we'll take it from there. But Cheryl, if you could shoot me your contact info, we'll pick up shortly.
I will do that, sir.
Thank you very much for coming. Committee, that is our conversation for this afternoon. I'm going to take us off of YouTube, but if committee members can stick around a moment, I'd like to have another conversation.